Dear ladies and gentlemen, I'm really happy to see such a full crowd today. I'm here on behalf of the Erasmus Prize Foundation. We're co-organizing this event with the Studium Generale of Groningen University and the Scoop Gravitation Program on Sustainable Cooperation. And so today we have a very special speaker, Professor Michèle Lamont. She is Canadian by origin. She studied and worked in Europe and in the United States at different universities. She's currently at Harvard University. She's professor of sociology, African studies, and European studies, and she conducts several large programs of research, among others on successful societies. She's published a number of books on social inequality, on how people in different societies cope with stigmatization, how they try to get respect for what they do. And she was awarded this year's Erasmus Prize for all her work and all that she did to connect this type of academic knowledge to real world problems. So we're really privileged and honored to have her here today and to give her talk for us. Please.
Well, thank you so much, dear colleague, for inviting me here. I'm extremely grateful. It's my first time in this part of the country, and I hope I'll have a chance to come back one day and explore it more than I'm capable this time. I'm particularly grateful to the colleague who are associated with the Sustainable Cooperation Program that has just been funded and which involves Raphael Vitek and Naomi Illemers, as well as a number of other colleagues. And of course, I'm extremely honored to receive the Erasmus Prize. And I hope to live up to the challenge of doing significant work until I die. So I consider myself still pretty young, so hopefully I have a few more good years. So the talk I'm going to give you today is really something that came together in the context of the last year, as I could witness what was happening in the United States. And I've been studying inequality for 30 years, but also I'm a cultural sociologist, which means that I'm mostly interested in the cultural dimensions of inequality. And what has been happening has really made me develop an even more greater sense of urgency in terms of developing the tools that social scientists have at their disposal to understand inequality. And that's not only the economic aspect of inequality, the aspects that have to do with distributions of resources or wealth, but also the aspect of inequality that has to do with stigmatization and racism and xenophobia. Okay, so that's what I'm going to be talking to you about. A lot of the talk is about the US, but I've also done quite a bit of work on France, and I'm Canadian, so there you will see a clear comparative dimension to the presentation. So here, the first image here is about the current moment. What we've seen over the last decades in the United States, in Europe, in North America and elsewhere, is that we have had a growing number of groups that are making claim for cultural membership. And cultural membership has to do with diffusing scripts or narrative or shared understanding about who is a worthy member of the community and trying to extend this definition to the largest possible number. So these groups that have been stigmatized have been claiming their cultural membership, have been asking to have their value fully recognized as part of the community. And I'm sure you're familiar with the Occupy movement, which denounced, the concentration of resources in the 1% of the population in the United States and elsewhere. Black Lives Matter, of course, has received world coverage. The LGBTQ movement internationally. In Canada, the First Nations have made major claims under the Idle No More movement. we have had in Europe many Muslims, in France in particular, claiming that to be able to practice their faith in public and to also carry markers of their faith in public. And in the United States, we have, of course, the working class white who have felt cheated of their rightful place in society. You've had also on American campuses many incidents about microaggression. So most famously at Oberlin College, a lot of students, started a social movement because they felt like the Korean food that was served was a case of cultural misappropriation. So the media made fun of that as a case of, snowflake college students who were so hypersensitive about their identities that, they were just pushing it a little bit too far. But what's important for the common purpose is just to say that a lot of what has characterized social movements for the last few years are movements that have to do with making claim for cultural membership. At the same time, I'm sure you're aware, we've seen an enormous increase in inequality over the last decade. So, particularly since the publication of Thomas Piketty's book, Capital, there's been a real increase in media awareness of inequality and how much it has increased over the 20th century. So in this context, distribution as an aspect of inequality has just received an extraordinary amount of media attention. But I will argue today that distribution is only half of the equation when it comes to understanding what inequality is about, and that in fact inequality is a deeply multidimensional phenomenon that we need to broaden our analysis to better capture how it operates. And I'm going to be bringing to you my sociological tools of analysis to see how can we define a more robust agenda to understand how this works. So where should we turn for guidance? In the 90s, we have two very important philosophers. So some of you may be familiar with the name of Axel Honneth, who's a very influential philosopher at Frankfurt. He is occupying, the chair that has been historically the chair of Adorno at the Frankfurt School. And Nancy Fraser at the New School have been debated the sources of injustice, and they've been engaged in a very influential debate on the politics of distribution and recognition as they influence the sources of injustice. So I think that they point us toward the terrain of inquiry that we need to take on. So the study of, is it gonna work? Of recognition and distribution of material resources, I believe, should be considered as separate but interactive dimensions of inequality. So we all know about, well, probably some of you know, about the social science literature on what we call the achievement gap. And the achievement gap is the observable consistent patterns of disparity in, for instance, educational achievement between racial and class groups that are observed in the United States, but elsewhere as well. And this is a huge business in the social sciences, learning about the achievement gap. Sociologist of education eat this for breakfast. But when it comes to, I think we need to add to this agenda, this very important agenda, a study of the recognition gap, which I will define as the disparities in cultural membership between groups. But some of you may wonder, why does recognition matter? Okay, what does it mean? Is it just about having people feel good about themselves? What difference does it matter if people are hungry or homeless? Is distribution more important than recognition? Well, I would argue that recognition matters a lot. It matters for a number of dimensions. So for instance, let's think about the poor. Well, we know that the poor are more stigmatized in the United States than they are in many other advanced industrial societies, as indicated by the fact that Americans are less likely to want to support redistribution of income toward the poor than it is the case in European societies. So in their daily life, studies of poverty show that they feel that they experience little compassion and solidarity, and they know that the government does almost nothing for them due to this lack of public support for redistribution. So they often feel alone and out of luck. And their plight is not only due to poverty, it's also due to stigmatization, to a lack of recognition, to the definition, the sheer definition of them as not valued human being. But it doesn't have to be this way. As we know, there's huge variation in how they're dealt with. So recognition and its mirror cultural process, stigmatization, have also been shown to have consequences for a number of important social outcomes, such as those that I've listed them there. So let's think about health disparity. There's a large literature on how the repeated experience of racism is feeding racial disparities in health in the United States, which are very large if we compare black and white. So it feeds chronic stress, which in turn influences these health disparities. It also influences directly access to resources. So we can think about the example of LGBTQ youth that are being kicked out of their house by parents who are not accepting their sexual orientation of their children. So this is a case where stigmatization leads to poverty. So it's not necessarily that poverty leads to stigmatization. There's an independent effect. It also influences experience of class. So we can think, for instance, of the way whether or not blue-collar workers or low-status white-collar workers feel like losers or not. It's not in all societies that they feel like losers, as I will explain in a few minutes. It's not because you don't have a college degree that you have to feel like a loser, but there's some national context where this is much more likely than others. And finally, it matters a lot for politics. So, here is our friend Donald Trump, our non-friend Donald Trump. So with some of my graduate students, we did a detailed content analysis, computer-assisted content analysis of the 73 electoral speeches that he gave during the electoral campaign to identify very precisely what were the groups that he was targeting. So how did he talk about gays, about the poor, about immigrants, Muslim, refugees, women, and others, including donors. And we analyzed very specifically how we try to appeal to the white working class. So in this paper that came out last week in the British Journal of Sociology, we argued that his presidential strategy was very much aimed at raising the relative status of these white working class men. And he did this first by removing blame, by telling them, yes, you're downwardly mobile, and this is not because you're lazy or because you lack moral character, but because of globalization, which is taking away your jobs. And then he promised to them jobs as part of a seduction scam. And I call it a scam because the policies that he's enacting since coming to power are all going around against the interest of these workers. But at the same time, he scapegoated the competition. We found that the one group that he talks most consistently negatively about are immigrants, but also to less frequently Muslim and refugees, since a lot of the campaign occurred during the Syrian crisis. So all these are ways of seducing the working class, but also he emphasized their role as protectors and providers for women and children, as well against Muslim, because Muslims are defined as not respecting human rights. And he even argued that, we should protect LGBTQs against Muslim, which is paradoxical given what he said about LGBTQs after coming to power. So all this to say, it's pretty obvious to me that you cannot understand the result, of the 2016 election without factoring in this recognition gap or the group boundaries. So the broader objective of this talk is really to develop a more ambitious sociology of recognition and stigmatization to help us understand inequality as a multidimensional phenomenon. You might think this is all heavy sociology, but you will see it will get really interesting. So in order to do this, we need concepts, we need measures, we need to describe empirically what this recognition gap looks like, whether it exists or not. But we also need, since social scientists mostly think about causality, we need to analyze the pathways through which these recognition gaps develop and how they can be narrowed. So this is exactly what I'm going to do today. And this is my little outline, and I'm going to describe to you how I'm going to proceed. First, I'm going to present a few concepts to frame the discussion, and I will discuss the growing recognition gap and changes in the boundaries toward the poor, immigrants, Muslim, and African and Blacks under neoliberalism, a concept I will explain in a second. Second, I will describe to you this recognition gap as a dimension of collective well-being, and I will emphasize how institutions and cultural repertoires can help extend cultural membership to the broader range of people. And this has to do with how to cultivate social resilience or sustainability, social sustainability. And third, I'm going to compare and explain to you how members of stigmatized groups experience and respond to stigmatization in various contexts, focusing on the US, Brazil, and Israel, talking a little bit about a book that came out last October. Well, October a year ago. And finally, I'll talk to you about the destigmatization of three groups. People with HIV/AIDS, a success story, because this is a group that became destigmatized rapidly over the last 30 years. The obese, unfortunately, the obese are not getting destigmatized at all. They're stuck. And then African Americans, which is a mixed case. So the challenge, as I see it, is really to figure out how to expand cultural membership to the largest member. So I'm analyzing this question through three different texts by looking at the resources that stigmatized people have at their disposal to respond to stigmatization, to how I'm looking at how social context enable different kinds of responses to stigmatization, and then I look at how social movements and knowledge producers engage in destigmatization. So this is a way to kind of feed our understanding of destigmatization from three different perspectives. So, but first, a few definitions are needed, and I'm going to start by talking to you about these conceptual tools that I'm going to use, which are listed here on this slide. So, whereas distribution is about material resources, Axel Honneth defines recognition as, come on, recognition. Sorry. Or what did I do? Escape? I'm not going to touch anything. Oh, thank you. It's dangerous. Okay. Here's Axel Honneth. I'm going to be careful not to touch anything here. I'm going to talk like this. So Honneth defines recognition as a social act by which positive social worth of an individual or group is affirmed or acknowledged. The second concept would be the concept of stigmatization, which is, borrowed from Erving Goffman, one of the great sociologists of the second end of the 20th century, where he defines stigmatization, and in some ways it's, which is the mirror opposite of recognition, as a process that consists in qualifying negatively identities and differences. So concomitantly, we can define destigmatization as the social process by which low-status individuals or group gain recognition or cultural membership. And finally, cultural membership is the status characteristic of those who are collectively defined as valued members of a community. So these topics have been, the object of a vast literature. So we can think of Frantz Fanon, of W.E.B. Du Bois, the literature on critical race theory, indigenous, disability, gender, LGBTQ studies, they all concern stigmatization. But a lot of that literature has to do with giving voice to the stigmatized group. The task of the sociologist is slightly different, in that I'm studying recognition and stigmatization as fundamental social processes. So the goal is really to advance our understanding of how this works in order to further clarify how it works. And this has a real pedagogical function, I think, and a role in giving people the tools they need to understand what's happening to them when they experience stigmatization. It's not only about helping people feel better. So I will often refer to this tool, cultural repertoire, which might seem a little bizarre for you, but which is very central to my field. And cultural repertoires refer to the toolkits to which we have access in our daily life to make sense of our world. So in the American context, the concept of the American dream is omnipresent, and people constantly draw on this to make sense of their lives. There are many other concepts. So in one of the books I'm going to discuss, I argue that the French workers are far more solidaristic than American counterparts, not because the French are naturally more solidaristic, but because in the French context, you have a number of cultural repertoires that are very readily available to them. For instance, Catholicism, socialism, republicanism, that work against boundaries toward, for instance, blacks or the poor, or so you're going to see me come back with this. And the point of this concept is to move away from a cardinal sin of contemporary social science, which is mythological nationalism, which is to focus on nations and to say the French are like this, the Dutch are like this, Americans are like this, or African Americans are like this, or the poor are like this. Instead, what we try to do is analyze how people make sense of their lives, and how, in order to do this, they draw on the cultural repertoires that are available in their environment. So I'm going to start with this discussion of neoliberalism. And, for those of you who don't know what this is, although it's very much discussed in the news every day, neoliberalism has been analyzed as a set of mutually reinforcing changes which consist in the extension of the market principle and market fundamentalism to all aspects of society. So it means that, the principle of supply and demands animate everything. So, and these changes operate at the level of the economy, at the level of the state, to the extent that the state's role is now to facilitate the functioning of market mechanisms so that there's no hindrance to it. But it also functions at the level of and this is very important to my argument, at the level of the transformation of the scripts for the self, the way that people think of themselves and think about what defines a worthy individual. So with neoliberalism comes a diffusion of these cultural repertoires that emphasize social success, making money, competitiveness, and very importantly, what social scientists have called the privatization of risk. The privatization of risk means that we're all supposed to be self-reliant. We're not supposed to depend on the state to take care of us. And these principles of what defines a worthy person really comes to influence how people think about other groups, such as the poor, okay? So people who study this have argued that these neoliberal scripts are really spreading throughout not only your society, but my society, and it is really affecting the recognition gap and the transformation of group boundaries. And this is evident when we consider trends from the last decade in, for instance, France and the US, and even more broadly in Europe. So here I'm going to draw on some books that I've written, one of them being this one, The Digna Forking Man. In this book, I did 150 interviews with workers, low-status white-collar workers and blue-collar workers in the US, blacks and white, in France, white and North African. And I tried to identify how do they define a worthy person? Who do they feel inferior and superior to, different and similar to? What are the values that they want to pass on to their children? And a lot of these values ended up being articulated around the notion of a moral self. This is a group that largely defines itself by its capacity to keep the world in moral order. But from this definition of their worth as people, who are able to pay their bills, keep their kids out of trouble, they define themselves as survivors who continue, even if they live in very different situations, and they largely define themselves as survivors. Then they contrast these moral qualities through which they define their own value with the groups that they consider do not have these qualities. And all this happens in the context of where these white working class men are experiencing a growing recognition gap at several levels due to their economic downward mobility. We've had a desindustrialization process, which means for these men, working is not only, losing their job is not only an economic tragedy, it's also a cultural tragedy to the extent that they find their worth through their capacity to work. So this is one area in which they've experienced a recognition gap. They've also experienced descaling. They've experienced the declining prestige of their national identity, at least in the American context, where the great, 20th century of American exceptionalism has been suffering a lot over the last 30 years. They've experienced a growing recognition gap at the level of gender identities, as these women that they were so proud of protecting and providing for don't want to be provided for as much anymore. So they're losing the pride that they've had in their role as providers. So this decline in general has generated a great deal of anger and resentment. So while in this book, The Digna Forking Man, I argue that in the US, this self-concept has generated very different patterns of boundaries. In the US, in doing these interviews, I found that they said, typically a stereotype, I'm the kind of person who works through thick and thin, I pay my bills, I'm the kind of hardworking person, and I really am pissed against these people who sponge off the system, especially these people who live on welfare, especially these Black people. So you can see the sequence that is, tightly connected, where I go from being a moral person to drawing boundaries toward the poor and then people on welfare, and this is all bundled up together. And with a strong focus on self-reliance. So the more neoliberalism spreads, the more they're pissed at people who sponge off the system, who don't carry their weight. At the same time, when I did the interviews for this book in the suburbs of New York in the early 90s, they rarely stigmatized immigrants. Their definition of immigrants were largely people who come to the US to live the American dream, and as long as they live the American dream, we're fine. In France, I found very different patterns. They similarly define themselves as the people who keep the world in moral order, but they were far more inclusive toward the poor, saying these are people who are victims of the market. It just happens that they're out of work, so we need to take care of them. Capitalism is rotten, and this year it's their turn. And they were far more inclusive toward Blacks, saying, well, Republicanism tells us color doesn't matter. And many people told me that, exactly. So they downplay race as a basis for division, but on the other hand, they were far more exclusive toward Muslims. And they viewed Muslims as having values that are fundamentally incompatible with the values of the French. And again, presuming their lack of self-reliance, presuming that they came to France to take advantage of the welfare state. So these patterns have changed somewhat over the last 20 years. Focusing on the French case, I wrote this paper with a colleague who knows very well the current French literature, and we showed that in those last 20 years, the patterns in France have converged a lot with the patterns in the US, in that boundaries toward Blacks have become not much stronger, in part because Blacks now include a number of West African Muslims, so a convergence between Blacks and Muslims. And this group is more blamed for its fate than they were a few decades earlier. Boundaries toward Muslims have worsened a lot, in part because of the downward mobility of the white working class and the lower middle class. They are far more critical of the poor, and they have embraced the values of neoliberalism, such as the privatization of risk, which is asking that the poor be self-sufficient. So very much, the Front National is feeding into this, and my collaborator, Nicolas Devaux, wrote a book titled The Autonomy of Welfare Recipients, to show how the framing of the poor has been revolutionized in France over the last 20 years. We know from another paper I wrote that there was a pretty similar pattern in Western Europe as a whole, with stronger boundaries toward Muslims. So I think probably some of you are very familiar with this, and also boundaries toward the poor becoming stronger, especially in Eastern Europe. So we know that many of the American working class has experienced changes that are not unlike the changes that we've seen in France, because surveys show that Americans have less solidarity toward the poor today than they've had previously, with a strong focus on moral failure as a cause of poverty, as opposed to structural factors. And this is even true of African Americans, who have historically been shown to be more compassionate toward the poor. We can see this in surveys. So, by some account in the US, boundaries toward the poor have weakened. So we see that, for instance, in data on spatial and institutional segregation. But boundaries toward immigrants, particularly toward illegal immigrants, have greatly rigidified, but unevenly across social groups. So, for instance, Asians are welcome far more than Latinos, and the Trump speeches have capitalized on these very changes. So the general point here is really that neoliberalism is having an impact on how people think about who's in and who's out, who's worthy, who has cultural membership, and toward whom should we have solidarity. So now let's turn to the second part of the talk, which is really about collective well-being and how we may be able to use collective resources such as cultural repertoires and institutions to change the situation. So the various social sciences have developed different measures of collective well-being. So health experts talk about low infant mortality and high life expectancy. These are the least ethnocentric measures we know. Most human beings agree that these are good things. But we have also economists who talk about the Gini index, which has to do with the extent of inequality. Political scientists talk about how corrupt political systems are. So since 2002, I've been involved in a research project called Successful Societies. And it's an interdisciplinary group. We meet 3 times a year since 2002, so that's a lot of meetings. And we've been thinking together about collective well-being from the perspective of culture. Basically, the issue of how to increase social solidarity and social integration. So one of our group members, his name is Wilkem Lika, is one of the leading theorists of multiculturalism. He came up with this multicultural index, which compares all society based on how many things do they do to integrate minority members, whether ethnic, religious, or racial minority members. And with his multiculturalism index, they have shown that societies that rank higher on this index, so for instance, that have adopted, the most programs to facilitate the integration of immigrants, have immigrants that are emotionally and cognitively more involved in the society in which they live, and also much more likely to want to run for political office. So if you send to these policies a message to the immigrants that they're valued members of the society, they engage more. So this is an example of how resources, institutional resources, such as multicultural programs, can really be leveraged, can be mobilized to send messages of cultural inclusion to segments of the population. We have the same thing when it comes to same-sex marriage, right? In the 32 states that have voted same-sex laws in the last few years, there's been a decline of 7% in the incident of attempted suicide among LGBTQ youth in high school. So that's another example where laws are resources to destigmatize and to send implicit messages about who's in and who's out and who belongs. So cultural repertoires of this sort, laws acting as cultural messages, have a direct impact on solidarity, and they are tools by which people can define, solidarity. So I would argue, and that's one of the main arguments of some of the work that I've done lately, that this is a book that I co-authored with the group Successful Society, and in this book we developed this argument that cultural repertoires and institutions make really a big difference in terms of cultivating solidarity and collective resilience. And one of the arguments in there is that societies are more supportive when they are based on a plurality of criteria based on which we can define the value of people. So societies that basically only emphasize economic success and competitiveness as criteria of worth condemn the majority of the population to be losers, because if the model, as in the American dream, the model of success that is offered is one where you have, you know, a couple who both are college educated and professional and managers, there's not more than 20% of the population that meets this model. So you cannot offer a model of success to the whole population that condemns the majority of the population to fail. So really, one big takeaway here is we don't want to cultivate a society where the majority think of themselves as losers. Instead, we, as citizens, as policymakers, and I'll come back to this in the conclusion, we need to diffuse cultural frameworks, because that's one of the big functions of social scientists and policymakers. We engineer the public sphere together, we engineer shared understanding of what the society is about. And this society should value a plurality of criteria for it, such that the businessman, creative people, craft people, spiritual leaders, or pillars of the community should feel like they're highly valued citizens. So social resilience, we argue, really results from the engineering of institutions and cultural repertoires that broaden cultural membership. Now I'm going to turn to this book, Getting Respect, which came out last year, which I co-authored with 7 authors. 3 of them are from Israel, 2 of them are in Brazil, and there were 2 American authors. And we're all members of stigmatized group, most of us. I'm a Quebecois, we have Black African American, we have several Jewish people, we have a Mizrahi. And the question we did over 400 interviews with working class and middle class men and women living in Rio de Janeiro, New York, in and around, in the suburbs of Rio, Tel Aviv, and, Tel Aviv, Rio, and New York. And we asked questions about incidents of racism that they encountered. Well, more specifically, we asked them, can you describe to me an incident where you were treated unfairly? Describe to me what happened, where were you, how did you respond? And then we also ask more normative questions. What do you teach your kid about how to respond to racism? What are the best tools that your group has at its disposal to respond to racism? So these questions generate, on the one hand, narratives about actual experiences they had, but also normative responses. What should we do? And then we use this, computer-assisted content analysis software, and we compared, all of this. So for the US, for instance, we had over 700 incidents that were mentioned, and we tried to identify how they looked, these incidents, what kind of incidents they talk about, and how did people respond across these places. We came up with really interesting things. So I'll give you one example so you know what I'm talking about. It's an African-American man who finds himself alone with several white men in an elevator in New York. So he describes the interaction as follows. He says, one of them made a joke about blacks and monkeys. I said, man, I ain't into jokes. His demeanor changed, my demeanor changed. All the positive energy that was in there was being sucked out because of the racial part. I told myself, get out of here, because if I stay here, I'm going to explode. I'm going to be in that circle and I won't be able to get out. The stress level rose. My tolerance was getting thin, my blood pressure peaking, and my temper rising. By the grace of God, thank you, Jesus, as I stepped off the elevator, there was a black minister walking past. I said to him, can I talk to you for a minute, because I just encountered something that I got to talk about because I'm this far from exploding. So I've been at this job for just a week. This is all I need to get me fired. Now I'm just trying to get through the affair to decide whether I should go to the city to complain. So here you have the example of the incident that describes, and then he explains to us how he was thinking about what to do. He said, I had to calm down. This black pastor gave me relief because he could relate to what I had just experienced. Now I'm in the process of deciding what to do. So he explains his reasoning. So our book, which is based on over 400 interviews, as I said, compares these 3 countries, and we chose them in part because in Brazil you have very low level of residential segregation across racial groups, and in Israel you have very high level, and the US falls a little bit in between. So we wanted to compare basically societies with very rigid racial boundaries, ethno-racial group boundaries, the case of Israel, and more fluid one to understand how responses work to get differently. And we also had blacks in the 3 countries in the sense that the study was basically comparing African Americans, black Brazilians, and in Israel we had 3 groups. We had Ethiopian Jews who are black, right? We had Palestinians, Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel, who have been the most excluded group in the Israeli context. And we have the 3rd group who are Mizrahi Jews, who are Jews whose family immigrated from Yemen and Iraq, and they are at the bottom of the labor market, as are black Brazilians. But since they're Jewish, they don't think they're that excluded in the context of Zionism. So it's a stigmatized group that doesn't think it's that stigmatized. And then we went about comparing the experiences, and we found really important differences. So one of the main findings of the book is that instead of talking about discrimination, cases where they did not have access to resources, housing, jobs, healthcare, education, in fact, they mostly talked about what we came to call assault on dignity, which is, the fact of being ignored, underestimated, misunderstood. And this is the main kind of things that they talk about. And they have to do with violation of dignity or respect. They have to do with stigmatization. There are things you cannot sue about. So for instance, a teacher who says, every morning I walk in the teacher's room, no one says hi to me. And they always say hi to the white man who comes in a few minutes after me. So this is the wear and tear. Epidemiologists talk about the allostatic load that gets under the skin and, really contribute to racial disparities in health. So another example is a worker who says that at work is misunderstood. He says, I'm a token at work. No one shares my philosophy. No one ever confirms what I'm saying. They don't understand my taste. They don't understand anything about me. He says, they all think I'm a Martian. So this is really pervasive, and it's more frequent than discrimination. So that's the main thing you find across the 3 sites, but then there's differences in what kind of experiences of stigmatization they talk about. One of the big differences is that black Brazilians are much more likely to say that they are being stigmatized as poor or uneducated than Americans are, than black Americans are, and they are much less certain when they experience racism or classism than their American counterparts. So they will denounce racism only if they're absolutely certain that it's about racism, as they say it, if race has been named. And there's a number of factors that I'll mention later to explain that. Arab Palestinian, the experience is very different because they're often presumed to be sympathizers with the Palestinian cause. Therefore, they are viewed as the enemy within. They're presumed solidary with, and they experience extremely blatant and violent insults, such as "you dirty Arab." So there's no ambiguity about their exclusion, and they do not complain about being misunderstood because it wouldn't make sense for them to hope to be understood, given the socio-political context of Israel. Now, turning to responses, the study is totally inductive. When we started, we just asked these questions and then we analyzed what came up. So we started, I don't know if you're familiar with Albert Hirschman's classic book, Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. We kind of started with that, but this is what we came out with. And we found that confronting was the most predominant response in the US, used by something like 80% of our respondents, and they mostly did that by using the law. So for instance, Human Relations Department, their unions, and people repeatedly say, you don't have a choice, you have to confront, you have to speak up. It's almost like a mantra. So we found that 4 out of 5 of our American respondents say that you have to confront, compared with only half of the Brazilian, and still fewer among Arab and Palestinian. So one example is Megan, who's a teacher. She's a badass. She says so. It's not me. She says so. She describes how she deals with white people who cut in front of her at the supermarket. She says, white people, they do that all the time. They're just trying to be superior. And she explains how she recently told off a white woman by saying to her, who just cut in front of her, she says, you don't do this because I'm black, you do this because I'm white. because my being black has nothing to do with you. So she's pointing to white privilege. She reflects, of course, it comes to a shock to them. They don't want the confrontation. If you confront them, they're not going to give you a word back, i.e. they're not going to respond, because you're simply not there. I don't think she's going to do this to too many other black women. One woman, I actually put my foot out to trip her. So she's pissed. The second most popular response among African American is what we called management of the self. So here, respondents think about the practical implication of responding. So one woman says, I don't want to be the black angry bitch again. I want to be viewed as the successful lawyer, someone who's going somewhere. Therefore, when something happens to me, instead of getting upset, I go away, I try to calm down, I talk to my friends to reason with her about what has happened, to verify that my understanding of the situation is accurate, because I don't want to be flying off the handle all the time. So really this management of self takes an enormous amount of energy, and half of our respondents say that they use this as a response. Another popular response is what we call no response, as in I was so surprised I couldn't say anything, and that's also quite frequent in the US. The response we expected to see most often because of the context of neoliberalism that I described earlier is what we call, displaying competence and work. I'm going to work hard, I'm going to go show that I'm a good worker, I'm going to be competent, and this will allow me to counter racial stereotypes, to show that I'm really smart and, I know what I'm doing. And that response was far less frequent than what we had expected. But on the other hand, when we asked them, what do you tell your kids about how to respond to racism? That was by far the most predominant response. So it's a little bit like the neoliberal scripts of Worthy Self are most salient when they talk about normative response. How do you counter racism? You be upwardly mobile, you get your education, you get your occupation, you become middle class, you consume, and you enjoy the fruits of abundance that America offers. In this way you get even, but you also demonstrate that you have cultural citizenship by the mere fact of consuming. So, shared citizenship is not based on the fact of being human beings or citizen. It's really about upward mobility. In Brazil, we have quite different patterns with confrontation, no response, and management of the self, being equally salient. And Black Brazilians, as I said, experience far more uncertainty about racism. And for their part, Arab Palestinians simply ignore, as they have very little hope about changing anything, which is the last thing Americans will do. So how do we account for this? Well, as good social scientists, we spend a lot of time thinking about causality, so we came up with, a multi-dimensional explanation that draws on 3 sets of dimensions. And I'm going to go fast here because I realize I've already spoken for almost 50 minutes. So basically what we say is that the first set of factors has to do with background. How unequal is society? So the fact that Brazil is one of the most unequal societies in the world certainly leads people to think that what they're experiencing has more to do with inequality than it has with class. How concentrated are the poor at the bottom, are Black people at the bottom? The second set of factors are the cultural repertoire I just talked about. So this is like Zionism, the American dream, racial democracy, what the national ideologies are about, but it's also the transnational repertoire, such as neoliberalism or human rights, that people can really draw on. And the third factor, which is the least commonsensical, is what we call groupness, which has to do with how people think about us and them. But as this has to do not only with what's in their head, how they self-identify, but also with the extent to which they interact with other groups, how much there is diversity in their neighborhood, in their workplace, and also what are the widely available scripts about the other group, okay? So we argue that the 5 groups we study vary a lot in their degree of boundedness. Basically, we have 2 very strongly bounded groups, African Americans and Arab Palestinians, but they react very differently. One confronting all the time and the other one not confronting at all. So it's not a linear relationship. And we have 3 weakly bounded groups, but they're weakly bounded very differently. And I could expand on that in the question period if you want. So then I'm going to give you an example of our explanation, how we deploy it, by talking about this wonderful, elegant black Brazilian woman who comes back to her hotel in the evening after a day of work. So she gives the clerk at the hotel her room number so that she can get her key. But instead of giving her the key, he takes the phone and he calls the room. And since no one answers, he hangs the phone and he winks at her and he says, I'm sorry, he's not there. So obviously he thinks she's a prostitute. And she's very upset, but she feels that she cannot confront because, you know, when we ask her 10 years later to give us an example of an incident, this is the incident that she mentions. And she concludes for us, she says, I could not confront him because he did not say anything that I could point to show that he was being a racist. He did not pronounce anything explicitly racist. So I went to my room, I called my husband who's white, I explained to him what happened, and he told me to calm down, to go to bed, and that I was exaggerating, but she's obviously very pissed. So what is enabling this response? So our argument is that in the Brazilian context, you have this repertoire of racial mixture, which basically says that we all have a black grandmother somewhere. So therefore, there's no point to, opposing blacks and white. We're all a little bit black, which really works against the polarization between groups, and it lowers the likelihood that people will say, you damn white racist. So by lowering the salient of racial polarization, this contributes to the greater visibility of class discrimination, and it enables the fact that she does not confront, just as is the weak boundedness of the black Brazilian experience. So they think that their identity is anchored in shared skin color, not in shared culture or shared history. And this also means that the cultural schemas about racism, which are so omnipresent in the US, are far less present in Brazil. And all these factors contribute to this woman being far more hesitant to confront the hotel clerk. So not having immediate access to the scripts that are the tools she could use to confront really affects how she responds. In contrast, why are African Americans such as Megan much less hesitant to define an incident as racist and to confront than their Brazilian counterpart? So we argue that Megan's confidence is enabled by ready-made scripts about racist interactions between blacks and whites, which are sustained by an awareness of racial exclusion, inequality in history, and which confirms that she is actually witnessing racial exclusion. So you have also a legal culture which is extremely powerful, which is based by backed by the Civil Rights Act, which convinces her that it's entirely legitimate for her to stand up for herself when facing racist slights. So her strong sense of groupness makes her race salient and convinces her that being cut in line has to do with racism, even if nothing is said. And this feeds her confidence to respond in this way. In Brazil, again, in contrast, confronting is generally done in a far more low-key way, and our respondent talks about the importance of educating the non-blacks, but in a very calm and pedagogical fashion, not to confrontation. So in contrast to those groups, very few Arabs ever use legal tools to respond. Even in the most terrible case of housing discrimination, they don't seek legal redress. So in a quarter of the incidents we analyzed, they said that they remained silent or ignored as a way to express emotional detachment in a situation that many of them see as hopeless. So this is both a form of resignation, but also a way to protect self-worth and to put themselves above the aggressor. So as a postal worker states, the best way to stick it to someone is to actually ignore them. So in this context, self-isolation is a response that makes sense because they live in a context of very high residential segregation, and confrontation is unlikely to yield results. So unlike Brazilians, they very rarely have doubts about whether or not an incident occurred, and alternative explanations are very limited by the level of groupness that they experience. So to conclude, what is this book about? It's really, the argument is that how people experience and respond to racism is enabled by the cultural repertoires, by the context in which they live. It's, you know, you have to take into consideration a number of dimensions. So we reconstruct a causal chain. So now I'm just going to tell you in 2 seconds the last study, which I won't have time to describe, but basically we compare people who have HIV/AIDS, the obese, and African Americans, which have encountered different levels of success in terms of destigmatization. And we compare the role of, we use the secondary literature to see who was involved in the attempt to destigmatize these groups. And we argue that the main actors were cultural experts, knowledge producers, legal, medical, social scientists, journalists, who collaborate with social movements with different degree of involvement, as you can see on this table, with very different results. So what we have is this kind of causal path where we have different social actors who draw on cultural resources that are involved in their, that are available in their environment to destigmatize groups. So the point here is simply that just looking at the case of people with HIV/AIDS, destigmatization is a social process, okay? It is something that can be produced, and we need to understand better how it works. So when it comes to trying to produce more inclusive society, we could generalize, do another 10 studies like this one, and look at the destigmatization of other groups to understand how we are reaching and how it varies across societies, and how they have, our groups become more stigmatized. The case of Islamophobia in the US and Europe would be an excellent example. And for those of you who are psychologists in the room, we're saying that what we need then is to combine techniques that are now being used, like the implicit association test, to make people more aware of their stereotype and their racism, and combine this with broader understanding about processes of destigmatization to enact social change. Many, for instance, the Chicago police now is using the implicit association test to get the policemen more aware of their racism. But this cognitive approach is important, but I argue, and my collaborators argue, that it's far more, that it needs to be coupled with understanding how we can influence in the public sphere how groups are represented as really a complement, and that we can act upon this in a very systematic manner. So the conclusion is really about how can we change these things, okay? So the sociological agenda is to study stigmatization and destigmatization, its very dimension, but we can also think about an action agenda, which has to do with what can people do. So I already mentioned, well, the case of policymakers. So I mentioned the laws about same-sex marriage. So clearly, when policymakers make decisions, for instance, about poverty, they just think about typically distributing resources. But when in the United States they voted to have food stamps, they did not have in mind these poor welfare mothers who would be standing in line with the food stamp and being very publicly, being viewed as poor, asking. So clearly the question of policies to deal with poverty or with LGBTQ or any other group should consider both distribution of resources, but also the impact on stigmatization. In the same way, the law for same-sex marriage, the lawmakers had not necessarily conscientiously anticipated the impact on the decline of suicide among LGBTQ youth. But I think this is a wonderful lesson. As for the social scientists, I think one thing we really need to do is much more systematically study how people think about universalism. So when I was in France in the early 90s doing the interviews for the Digna Forking Man, I did a lot of interviews with North African immigrants concerning what they think make people equal. And these men who were, working as roofers or phone booth cleaners, terrible job, would tell me that we're all similar because we all spend 9 months in our mother's womb. We all have 10 fingers. We all get up in the morning to go buy bread. We're all the children of God. We're all equally insignificant, like clouds floating in the sky. We're all, they wouldn't use these words, but we're all cosmologically equally insignificant. So these are all very naturalistic metaphors, which are very suggestive of how non-college educated people think about universalism. And I think social scientists need to do much more research in terms of understanding how the average Joe think about what makes them similar and different from others. So there are different conceptions of morality across social classes. Is the conception of self-reliance is so central to people who are not college educated? They also mobilize other repertoires to think about what makes us similar and different. And I think we need to think much more seriously about how to activate this and how to understand better what pushes the humanistic buttons or the charitable buttons in terms of what we think we owe each other as human beings. And this brings me to the conclusion, which is really about what citizens do. And one of the things we've seen in the American context since the election is a lot of signs like this. And people fighting Trump and saying, we don't want to be a mean nation. We don't want to be xenophobic. We want to welcome people. And you have all the Universalist Church that have, you know, welcoming flags for LGBTQ people. So there's tons of expression of, you know, human sympathy and human solidarity that are exploding everywhere. And in Spain this summer, you had a lot of boat people from Africa arriving, and you had these pictures of upper middle class Spanish people in their bikinis welcoming people from Africa. So, you know, not to be idealistic or romantic about this, but I think that there's a lot of, you know, at some level, many people know that collective well-being depends on solidarity, and societies that experience growing inequality, like our society, that at the same time see a lot of social exclusion, suffer from a lot of ills. So for instance, more depression, more bullying in high school, in elementary school, more racism and stress. So, and not to mention more expenses, medical expenses to take care of everyone, including, you know, violence and deteriorating neighborhood. So there's little doubt in my mind that in terms of collective well-being, addressing both the problem of growing inequality and the recognition gap is really crucial at this point, and it should be very much at the top of the agenda for everyone, social scientists, citizens, and policymakers. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. So now I would like to give the floor to Professor Rafael Wittek. He's a professor of sociology at this university, and he's also the lead researcher on the Sustainable Cooperation Program. Rafael, please.
Thank you, Naomi. By the way, who doesn't know Naomi? Naomi is distinguished university professor at the University of Utrecht and one of the co-leaders of the program. Thank you, Naomi, for making this possible. Okay, let's see. Can race be erased? This is the title of an article that was published 15 years ago in the influential proceedings of the National Academy of Science. Using lab experiments, the team of evolutionary psychologists investigated the widespread claim that race, sex, or age are primary dimensions of person representation. Put differently, the human mind, according to these scholars, not them, but has a hardwired tendency to automatically categorize others based on these characteristics. This tendency holds for all individuals across all contexts. Since categorization is the first step for systematically treating people differently, this of course is bad news for anyone pondering the question how to alleviate racism or any other form of discrimination. Because if it is hardwired, little can be done to change it. Kurzban and colleagues advocate a different view. They argue that no part of the human cognitive architecture is designed specifically to encode race. Instead, encoding by race is a reversible byproduct of cognitive machinery that evolved to detect what they call coalitional alliances. Consequently, one of their key propositions is that the strength of race encoding, categorizing, depends on the social context, decreases where it is not a valid cue to coalitions or alliances. So how did they come to this conclusion? And bear on me a while to explain you the experiment, because it's important. It was based on what psychologists call a memory confusion protocol. Subjects see pictures of individuals who differ along one or more dimensions of interest, like race, sex, or age. In this study, each individual was said to belong to one of two rival basketball teams. And that they had been in a fight during the previous season. The subjects were told that these individuals are engaged in a conversation. And they were shown pictures, and each picture was then paired with a statement that was supposedly uttered by that individual. This was phase 1 of the experiment. In phase 2, subjects were then asked to recall who said what. And this is a difficult task, and individuals make a lot of errors. But then, by analyzing the pattern of errors, the experimenters can tell whether the subject had encoded a categorical dimension of interest during phase 1. Let's take an example. Suppose half of the targets were women and half were men. If a subject indeed encoded the sex of targets during phase 1, that subject's errors in phase 2 will not be random. They will be more likely to misattribute a sentence uttered by a man to another man rather than to a woman, or vice versa. Errors in recall allow to unobtrusively reveal whether subjects are categorizing target individuals along a dimension of interest. And it's a similar technique like the implicit association test Michèle just told us about. In this experiment, there were 2 manipulations. In the first one, let's see, the verbal-only condition, all speakers, the pictures with these guys, were identically dressed. And the only way to infer coalitional alliances for the subject was based on the content of the statements of this individual, like the sentence they were reading. So, for example, that one of the guys said, "Well, it's the other group that started the fight they had in the previous season." In the second condition, shared appearance, this verbal content was accompanied by variation in the color of the shirt worn by the individual, a red shirt and a yellow shirt, so 2 different teams, 2 different alliances. The researchers found an impressive decrease in racial categorization from the verbal-only condition to the combined condition, and an even larger increase for coalitional categorization. Results were different for gender. Whereas coalitional categorization increases in a similar fashion as in the case of race, gender categorization decreased only slightly. So in a way, gender is much more deeply ingrained in our brains, apparently, but race is not. So just exposing subjects to this cue of coalitional alliances changed their implicit encoding. It's an unobtrusive measure, though. There's nothing conscious going on. In a pre-registered replication study carried out by scholars from the University of Leuven in 2014, these findings were reproduced, though the effect sizes were somewhat weaker. So this is not a one-shot study, as we often see, unfortunately, but there is something to it. So Kurzban and colleagues, they could hardly hide their excitement when they conclude at the end of their article, these results suggest that racism may be volatile and eradicable construct that persists only so long as it is actively maintained through being linked to parallel systems of social alliance. So basically, they say, hooray, we found a way to erase race. Professor Lamont's cultural process approach would tell us to be a little bit more cautious, I think. So the optimism about the possibility to erase race seems a bit premature, since there is still a long way to go from fluctuations in individual level categorization to the persistence of symbolic boundaries at the macro level. At best, the work of Kurzban and colleagues addresses one part of a much more complex story. And I try to reconstruct it here a little bit, building on Professor Lamont's work. The cultural process approach to inequality was really innovative in the field in several respects, and I want to mention three. So first, as we already heard, her account of inequality transcends the common conceptualizations of inequality as either material resources or symbolic outcomes. It adds an important third dimension, unequal distribution of recognition. Second, it gets grip on how micro-level cognitions and individual boundary work aggregate into macro-level inequalities through cultural process at the meso level. By conceiving categorization as a collective accomplishment, not just as something individual that happens to people because they are exposed to a certain situation, this approach literally reveals a part of the inequality equation that has long been missing. And this part does not really give reasons for being overly optimistic. It shows how boundaries are constantly recreated in a routine fashion, often unconsciously so, and even in the absence of a dominant actor who might have an interest in creating or perpetuating inequality. Now, you ended your talk with a reference to social policy, and your work encourages us to think about how societies can broaden cultural membership and increase the diversity of criteria that define a worthy life. So the question arises whether, and if so how, these approaches can guide us in the design of institutions, policies, or interventions. The coalition detection approach, which is rooted in evolutionary psychology, views categorization and its potential inequality outcomes primarily as the result of instrumental, though not necessarily conscious, solutions to individual-level cooperation problems. In contrast, the cultural process approach points to the role of societal-level classification schemes, their legitimation through the state, and their collective reproduction at the micro level. Could something be gained by combining these two perspectives? I guess that Professor Lamont would be skeptical about such an effort. The two perspectives might seem incompatible also with regard to some of their underlying assumptions. Nevertheless, I would like us to explore this option. And I have several reasons. I will limit myself to two. So the first one relates to the discussion in psychology about motivated cognition. A key in Professor Lamont's argument is that we dispose of a variety of cognitive schemata, a about symbolic boundaries on which we can potentially draw. Which of them will become salient depends on the social context. And since it is the state who shapes and legitimizes systems of classification, the symbolic boundaries we draw are strongly rooted in macro-level institutional structures. Like Professor Lamont, also Kurzban and colleagues study individual-level cognition. But where Professor Lamont's approach emphasizes the structural roots of categorization, their account highlights the importance of its motivational basis. It is about what psychologists call motivated cognition. Which schema is activated in a given situation depends on the kind of goals and motivations that are salient. For example, categories of ethno-religious group membership can be very salient in a situation where in-group, out-group distinctions matter a lot, like in competition. They may be pushed in the background in situations of high mutual interdependence, which require cooperation to achieve joint production. To serve as a potential tool for institutional design, we need to clarify the motivational basis of cultural processes. What people strive for, their short-term desires, their long-term goals, do influence what people see, how they categorize, and what they do not see. Such goals also strongly shape the frame through which we see the world, and they play a fundamental role in hampering or sustaining cooperation. So I think incorporating this dimension, motivation, into a cultural process approach is not only necessary, but it is also feasible. Whether or not the coalition detection approach sketched in the beginning can be useful for such an endeavor remains to be seen. It may provide a first lead. Now, the second reason for why we should briefly discuss motivational issues is maybe more anecdotal. And Professor Lamont made a link that is not common in the field. It is the link between inequality and solidarity/cooperation. The anecdotal evidence I want to show you is relating to a secular trend in attention, and that's the attention for specific categories of social problems, both in society and in science. So there is no doubt that inequality currently is a very hot topic in the general public, but also in academia. A quick and very dirty Google Trends analysis done by myself reveals that in 2004, cooperation was far more frequent as a search term than inequality. And in 2017, their positions reversed in terms of what is more frequently entered. We also notice a gradual decline in the use of the search term morality. Put differently, the growing interest in inequality comes with a declining interest in morality and cooperation among Google users then. Yeah? Of course, such trend analysis of search terms should be digested with caution, and interpreting them is difficult. The titles of scientific articles may provide a slightly more reliable indicator for changing interest in a particular topic. I conducted another sophisticated analysis of frequencies of scientific articles with the term inequality or the term cooperation in the title. And the findings show that both topics co-evolved at the same level of frequency until the early 80s, as you can see. After which they diverge more and more. Whereas interest in inequality grew almost exponentially, academic interest for cooperation remained stable for 30 years, and it experienced a modest uplift from the year 2005 onwards. In the year 2016, inequality was found 3,000 times in the title of scientific articles, compared to about 1,000 articles with the word cooperation in the title. A look at the relative frequency of the two concepts further shows that after a peak in the 1950s, the proportion of studies on inequality dropped to an all-time low in the 1950s, and the proportion of studies on inequality dropped. So what you see here is the proportion of studies dealing with inequality or solidarity, and you see a downturn from 1945 to approximately the 1965. So there it is really oscillating, but then inequality trumps cooperation. Again, take such figures with caution, but they illustrate my point. Both for scientists and policymakers, it will be extremely difficult to face the inequality challenge if the underlying puzzles of cooperation are out of sight. I want to conclude. So Professor Lamont's work has pulled our understanding of inequality to the next level. Her cultural process theory emphasizes cognition, structure, and their interplay. It downplays the role of individual level intentions, motives, and goals. At least that's how I read your work. Maybe I misinterpreted it. But much of our daily cognition is motivated cognition. When it comes to translating our insights on inequality into policy, we might benefit from reinforcing the links between cultural process theory, motivated cognition, and fundamental research on cooperation. The Dutch government's 18 million euro gravitation grant to our SCOOP consortium puts us into the privileged position to pursue these links in much more depth during the coming decade. Your work, Professor Lamont, will certainly guide us in this effort. I hope that this encounter is just the start for an ongoing dialogue about how we as social scientists can make a lasting contribution in solving some of society's most wicked problems. Thank you.
Nooit eerder gedaan, dus ik weet het ook niet. Maar er is nu ruimte voor vragen uit de zaal. We lopen een beetje... Sorry, we're running out of time. Completely confused here. But if you are patient to stay for a few more minutes, we can have a few questions from the audience. Directed towards Professor Lamont or Professor Wittek. So, who wants to ask a question? Who dares?
I wondered, Miss Lamont, do you have a specific reason why you use the word gap? It reminds me of the subway in London, mind the gap, please. And I was thinking about it. Is it because it can be overcome, the gap? Or you can also use a word like abyss or cleavage, or that's...
Yeah, that's exactly it. I think gaps can be narrowed or extended. And also, frankly, economists dominate the field of the study of inequality in the US. And if we want to engage them, I think it's a good idea to use terms that will resonate with them. Many of them have been interested in this question of the educational gap, for instance. So I thought of it simply as a pedagogical tool. But I would not have used the abyss, certainly, because as suggested by the paper on stigmatization, I think that these are things, and you know, of course, the literature on xenophobia, etc., we know that these things vary a lot over time, and we can think about narrowing the gap, you know, or narrowing the social distance, the tools that social psychologists would use. But I didn't know about the subway in London, so...
Anybody else for question? First row here.
Thank you. Madame de Mont, you're talking very much about being inclusive towards stigmatized groups of society. Would you say we should also be inclusive towards xenophobes and rapists, for example?
Well, one of the other arguments that I'm developing now is that if all the groups that I started with suffer from the recognition gap, and that it makes sense to try to discuss more explicitly and openly the way in which this recognition gap is shared by various groups. I think that for the white working class, I mean, I had an experience recently, 2 weeks ago. We had a big conference in New York on Trump, and it was, of course, a bunch of academics, but there was one guy that had a Trump hat on, and he showed up, and I gave my paper on how Trump appealed to the white working class. And he said, well, it's very elitist, your position, because the one thing that Trump does for us is to give us jobs. And I said, well, you know, Trump's claim about giving jobs is really exaggerated. But one thing we know is that the white working men feel that, you know, they are suffered from a lack of respect. And all these groups that are targeted by them also suffer from a lack of respect. And you guys think you're defending one kind of morality based on hard work. And the progressive forces that oppose you think also that they're defending a kind of morality based on solidarity. So we really need to talk very explicitly about this moral contest that is happening now, and make people maybe talk more about the ways in which, you know, the xenophobia hurts Muslims just as much as your loss of work hurts you. And in fact, basically, at the human experience, the quest for respect and dignity is a universal quest. And because of what I was saying about North African immigrants and this notion that there's good and bad people in all races, or that we all get up in the morning to buy our bread, or that we all have 10 fingers and we spend 9 months in our mother's womb, I think a lot of these commonsensical metaphor really appealed, you know, the conception of knowledge, and I know this from having done a lot of interviews with people who haven't gone to college, that, you know, the categories through which people think about commonality, I think it's really a source for building solidarity that has been ignored. So am I saying that we should pardon the racists? No, but I know for sure that when I was doing a lot of interviews with white racists in the US, from doing these interviews, I could understand how their sense of unfairness was grounded in the fact that they do their damn best to pay their bills, and they really are pissed when one of their coworkers is not pulling their weight. And they see a direct analogy between that experience and their hard work. So I think, you know, to try to get people to understand, it's not to pardon, but I think that a rigidification of position doesn't help. And that, you know, not to be too Habermasian in promoting deliberation, but I think at least in the American context now, people are so stuck in their own cultural silos and people throwing, you know, tomatoes at each other, that's clearly we're totally stuck, you know. And the last thing we want is for Trump to be reelected. And I think that if we're pursuing the strategy that a lot of the left is pursuing now, it's a total dead end. So that's where I stand. And I think a lot of the sexual violence is also connected to the white working class or the white middle class men feeling disempowered. So, you know, that needs to be discussed as well. I mean, to say very clearly, rape, sexual violence is about power. It's not about, you know, eroticism. So I think there was someone in there. Do we have more time or not?
Another question? Yeah? Else?
I also have a question for Professor Lamont. What are your views on reverse racism? Like racism towards the whites, or that is now commonly used in the media?
Well, now we know that the majority of white Americans think that there is reverse racism, but the surveys show that they don't know, they have never suffered of it. personally, and they don't know anyone who suffered of it. So this is really a case of pluralistic ignorance, and I think it's a case where, frankly, the social scientists need to be out there to denounce it, because the media, feed it night and day like Trump does, so I'm not worried. If I may respond briefly to the comments of Professor, I feel like you're totally, I would not have said this a few months ago, but now I'm coming because as a sociologist who was trained in France, Durkheim defined sociology in part as the focusing on the blind spots of psychology. And for me, because I was trained in studying cultural, collective representation, so not what is in people's head. So I've always felt ill-equipped, except when it comes to studying identity, because identity are intersubjective categorization. It can be studied without engaging in psychoanalysis. But now, as suggested by the slide connecting IAT with this, I'm much more ready now to think about, okay, I'm not going to do it, but the people who are equipped to study motivation should certainly do it. I feel very ill at ease with the literature of, on evolutionary psychology, because I don't believe there is human nature. And I think they very much like archaeologists are working on, figments of evidence. So I'm very skeptical. Often they say human beings tend to do X and there's no evidence whatsoever. So I'm skeptical about their work, but I'm totally open. And actually, if we think in terms of complementary disciplines focusing on different parts of the causal chain, well, then it makes totally sense for people to have different agenda that are complementary. But I recognize my own limitations when it comes to studying motivation. So,
Thank you.
Perhaps one final question?
I talked about the role of law, sociologist, and the citizen, but what role do you think the media plays in stigmatization and destigmatization, and which role would you want them to play?
well, right now, I think the media are in a major crisis in the United States. If we think about the public sphere as being produced by various groups of cultural producers, academics, journalists, religious leaders, entertainment, popular culture, we all feed into this, but as we know, since the end of network television, the media have been totally segmented, and many people have been writing on how the social media are feeding these echo chambers. So I'm very puzzled, and this is something that I'm in the process of reading about. And I don't have a solution, but as a cultural sociologist, I very much feel a sense of urgency. At the same time, we know that since Trump has been elected, the consumption of high quality news has increased enormously. The number of people who are reading the Washington Post every day, the Atlantic, Boston, Review, it's extremely high. So all this is very encouraging. The problem is really to get the people who consume Fox News to be open, but also, frankly, like me, to get people like me to consume Fox News so that we understand where Trump supporters are coming from. And that, I think, right now, there's no dialogue. But I think I know for a fact that the main schools of communication, like the Annenberg School at University of Pennsylvania, they're organizing conferences night and day on this. Everyone is very concerned. And I've read recently that religious organizations are losing a lot of influence in shaping the public sphere, in part because these white working class men, they are now increasingly isolated. They don't marry, they don't belong to the Knight of Columbus, they don't go to church. People, one book by a colleague who's a demographer wrote they spend a lot of time in their basement on consuming information in a very private way. So, yeah, so to speak.
Okay, I'm sure that we could continue for a long time. It's a very interesting discussion, but I think we have to close the formal part of the evening. I would like to thank all of you for your attention and for your questions. And of course, I would like to thank in particular Professor Lamont and Professor Wittek. And we have a few presents on behalf of the organizers, University of Groningen. So for you, we have 2 Dutch novels translated
wonderful.
in English.
Great, thank you so much.
To learn more about Dutch society.
Thank you so much.
Rafael?
They're not in Dutch, I'm happy.
For you, we have this.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you again.
Thank you.